Okay, this is fantastic. We'll let everybody come on in. Have to say thank you all for taking your time, either live now over the lunch hour if you're in Central US or wherever you're joining from, or if you're watching a recording after the fact. Thank you for taking the time. Can you guys see my screen okay?
I can.
Okay, cool. We'll give everybody a few more moments to come on in here. So for everybody joining, this is for you. This is our HADR virtual chapter, Open QA Palooza Fest thing, whatever you want to call it. This is for you. We've got some of the best people in the business on here to answer your specific questions, and quite frankly, we will go as long as we need today to make sure that we address everything. If a question is going to take too long for us to answer on here, send us your contact info in the private chat window on here, and we will get back to you with an answer and hopefully some links, and maybe we'll actually generate some blog posts out of this as well. So we'll go ahead and get started. This is the past community news for December 2019. We'll just run through this. The Board of Directors election is completed. Mindy, Melody, and Chris made it, so congrats to them. If you voted, awesome. If you didn't, what's wrong with you? You need to vote for these folks because these are the folks that help dictate where things go and how well they run. If you're interested, tomorrow, PASS Marathon for BI, starting tomorrow. Register now, completely free, and again, fantastic information. Hopefully, you didn't miss the PASS Summit this past year. It was awesome. If you did, and you need to be there next year, but you can go and you can actually purchase the content as a downloadable. It's hopefully coming out here fairly soon. I would highly recommend this. You can download them, you can buy them on a USB stick. I'm still watching videos from 2 and 3 years ago just because it's that much fantastic information. Talk to your management, get approval, not only buy these now, but be there next year, because there's a buzz there that you just don't get outside of there. If anybody wants some PASS branded merchandise, sale started a little over a week ago. Go check it out, passstuff.com, cool URL. We're not the only virtual chapter out there. There's a bunch out there. DBA Fundamentals earlier today, Cloud, HADR, that's us. DBA Fundamentals, more Cloud. Those folks are nuts. They've got sessions almost, I think, every week, if not multiple times a week. Performance chapter. There's a bunch of virtual groups out there. I think they're up to 20 now. I mean, just tons of great information. If you can't make it when they present live, it's all recorded, it's all out on YouTube. Go check it out. Just incredible amounts of free information. SQL Saturdays. If you've not been to a SQL Saturday, chances are you've been hiding under a rock. Go find the nearest SQL Saturday to you, go there. It's free, they're phenomenal. These are the people that write the books and the blog posts and the training videos that really drive how we go and learn about this stuff. And they're there for you, completely free. They're amazing. Charlotte was this past weekend, Washington, D.C. and Nashville coming up in the U.S. Slovenia, I really, really wish I could go to that one. It didn't work out this year. Lima was just this past weekend as well. Just amazing events. If you are looking for a career or recruiting for talent, PASS does have a career center. It's well worth checking out. Again, go for it. If you're even thinking about changing jobs, one, you're part of PASS. This is a tight community. You've got tons of people that have your back, so go check it out. If you're not already a member with PASS, by signing up for this, I believe you are, go check out their different social media channels. There's, again, tons of good information out there, completely free, pass.org. Okay, today's presenters, we have some of the best people in the business. Bob Pusateri, Brandon Leach, me, David Klee, Ed Leighton-Dick, Edwin Sarmiento, Elizabeth Noble, Matt Gordon, Peter Shore, Rick Lowe, Rob Volk, Taiob Ali, and Tom Norman, just amazing folks. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open this up. If you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat window here, and we're gonna talk through them. And quite frankly, anything goes. And we all have weird senses of humor, so at a minimum, this is going to be good for a laugh. Hopefully, there's a bunch of good content that comes out of this. Okay, we have our first question here. Okay, bottom line.
Hey, David.
Yeah. Yeah, go for it.
Before you get with the questions, one thing you are mentioned to them about the summit next year in Houston is the cheapest time to buy it
Oh,
right now.
Yes.
Yeah, buy it as soon as you can and as early as you can, because that's when it's the cheapest. Go ahead with your questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. So let me pull up the questions panel here. It's a little small. We've already got a bunch of questions. Fantastic. Okay, if I could find a way to make this a little bit bigger. This is awkward. There we go. Okay, question number 1. Should we run an availability group in synchronous automatic failover mode in a 2-node availability group over a 10 gig metro circuit between 2 data centers 12 miles apart?
I've done stupider things than that. That works. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly doable. I mean, I would still say that, you know, if one node goes down in that scenario, you're at risk of a full failure because you're down to one server. But I mean, that'll work.
Yeah.
What was the speed of the link, David?
12 miles. 10
No,
gig
what was
metro.
10 gig?
Yeah, 10 gig. To me, it's not about the throughput directly. It's more about the latency. If you've got sub-millisecond latency between those 2 data centers, I'm all for it. You know, as long as you can, as long as you can demonstrate that just the nature of being synchronous hasn't slowed the availability group down enough to interfere with operations, and usually with that architecture it won't. As long as you can do that, I would say with that architecture, perfectly fine.
Exactly. I would totally agree with that. The latency is the key here, because you have to remember that on a synchronous availability group, it commits to the secondary before it commits to the primary. And so any latency that you add into that pipeline is going to slow down your transactions. On a 10 gig link, at relatively short distance, you're probably not going to incur a high degree of latency, but you need to make sure you check that before you start.
Okay. There's a follow-up to this question.
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to add on to that. I would also say that, you know, anytime you're using an availability group, you want to monitor that latency, make sure that your secondary node isn't falling behind, or that someone's not running a bigger load. And if you are using something like read-only routing, right, or readable secondaries, you need to be aware that whatever workload is running on the primary is also going to run on the secondary. And so if somebody else comes in and runs something, it could cause an issue where the secondary actually slows down and isn't able to keep up.
Yep. Now, there's a follow-up to this. Alternatively, they're considering a 3-node availability group with 2 replicas in the primary data center that are synchronous and 1 async in the other location. Quite frankly, it all comes down to the latency between them. If it's a 12-mile geographic distance, you can't really tell directly from that. Are they routing you through a different part of the city, or maybe you're in the southern part of the city, the connection routes to the north side, and then your other data centers on the west side? I mean, what's the latency like? If it's acceptable, I would say to become more of a multiple active site, and I hate the phrase active, but to become more of a multiple active HA architecture, you'd be better suited with either a 2-way or 3-way in the same, really have them spread out where they're synchronous across data centers. You can still do a 3-way availability group where the 2 synchronous are in different data centers, and then have the 3rd async in the remote data center. And just like Brandon said, if the primary site goes down, you take the asynchronous replica, move it to synchronous, and your HA solution is now intact while you're at the DR location.
David, this is Taiob. I would take it a bit further. What I did recently is I took all the data, per availability group, added the, some of the latency data, and went to the app owners and the business owners, because I also want to know how their setup is on the front end, right? There may be some app like I can, like Tidal. I don't know if any one of you use as a job scheduler. Tidal is a product that you still, even if you fail over automatically, you have to do some configuration on the front end side to make it work. So they really don't want a automatic failover, even though they can sustain this latency. So I would suggest, after all, I agree with all of you, what you said, you check your latency and you collect some data, then go to the app owners, go to the business owners, go to the lead developers, show them and tell them, educate them a little bit. I'm going to post a blog post with some like commonly asked question about setting up availability groups. So, you don't give them like the whole books online, give them some common question they ask, and then ask them, what setting they prefer, and give them your options. That's how I would tackle this.
Perfect. Yeah, now there's a question here that I want to start with, because I'm the VM dork of the bunch. Question is, can you compare vMotion, so a VMware specific term, I'll talk about that in a second, as an HA alternative to an availability group or a failover cluster? Now, first of all, if those of you out there have not been exposed to these, the act of relocating a virtual machine while it's running from one physical machine to another is essentially, it's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. I call it magic. VMware calls it vMotion, Hyper-V calls it a live migration. The other hypervisors call it various different things, but the intention is the same thing. To me personally, I do not consider a vMotion or a live migration as an HA alternative. What happens there is that if the host were to fail that this VM is running on, that VM is down. That VM will be powered up on another known good host and it will come back up normally, but you're still looking at approximately a 2 to 2.5 minute outage, give or take. In the event that the guest operating system has a problem, let's say you hit a cork with Windows or a patch fails or just something hiccups, that operating system is down or that SQL Server instance is down, a vMotion will not help you with this. An availability group or failover cluster will help you for these scenarios where those things will be recovered on one of the secondary nodes. Now, the combination of vMotion or live migration with an availability group or an FCI gives you really, really good HA, because not only do you have the SQL Server side of HA already configured, you now have a platform that will essentially recover the replicas that went down onto known good nodes. It does it a whole lot faster than if it were two physical machines and one went down. You're at the mercy of that vendor to get that hardware back up. Anybody have any other comments on this one?
Yeah, David, this is
Ed.
Yeah.
This is Ed. And my biggest comment on this is that really with the vMotion versus the availability group, you're protecting two different things. With the vMotion, you're protecting the hardware, you're protecting the platform that your SQL Server runs on, which is good. But you are protecting. Think of it as you're protecting a snapshot in time. Yeah, the disk is going to ideally migrate with that, but with the availability group, you're actually protecting the data. And the data is the fastest moving, the fastest changing piece of the entire infrastructure. And with the availability group, you're shuttling that data over to your secondary replicas as fast as it can change. And so you're going to achieve a different type and a different level of data protection with your availability group than you're going to protect with your vMotion. I totally agree with what David said in conclusion that you're going to achieve much better high availability if you protect it both ways than with just picking one.
Yep. Okay, got another question here. This is a deep one. How can I clear the quarantined status of a cluster
I would
node?
add to that.
Oh, go ahead, sorry. Yeah, go for it.
I would add to that is consider how big the databases are on that server that is being vMotion, because as David said, you have that couple of minutes. That could be even longer if you've got a really large database, because it's effectively got to go through crash recovery. And if, depending on the scenario under which VM host crashing at corruption, which you're not going to have, or which you can mitigate the risk of with either the FCI or the AG solution.
Agreed, yeah. Basically, it's just the best possible coverage for all the different layers of the platform. Okay, got a deep one. How can I clear the quarantined status of a cluster node without taking the node down, as it is part of an availability group? So the command start cluster node, clear quarantine has been executed, state returned is up, but the status information still listed as quarantined, even though the node is up and running properly.
I'm trying to remember because I just did this a while back, believe it or not.
This may be a deeper one.
I want to say that I couldn't find a way to do it without actually removing it from the availability group and putting it back. David, do you know of any other ways to do that?
Off the top of my head, I don't. It's not an easy scenario. It really isn't. Anybody else have any?
This is Edwin. I just joined in. I'm at the Microsoft campus right now. The one thing that you have to think about with availability groups, you need to understand the impacts of any of the replicas that could be offline. So safest way, just remove it from the availability group. Whether you fix it faster or longer will not affect your availability group, because keep in mind, if you can't replicate to any of the replicas, your log file will constantly build up because you can't truncate that. So the safest way is just remove it from the replica and then fix it. Once you fix it, then you add it back.
The nice thing is that when I have had to do that in the past, it's been very easy to do, because as long as your replica is still within the window of the transaction log where the records are available, or if you have transaction log backups, and you really should have transaction log backups, you can replay those to catch it back up to that point in time. And so it doesn't have to be necessarily a painful process where you have to completely reinitialize that replica. It can be very quick and easy to remove it and fix the issue and put it back.
Okay, got another one here. This one's more of a comment, but I'm going to make it a question. Gentleman's database is not synchronizing and listed as recovery pending after the database has been restored and trying to join a TDE database into an availability group.
Okay.
Some of the costs of that.
Certificates. When you are going to add a TDE database to an availability group, you need to make sure that the certificate thumbprint matches on every single replica before you turn it on. If you do not do that, recovery will not be able to happen, because on one of them, the database will not be able to be decrypted.
It can even go a step further than that, in that the entire hierarchy of keys has to match. So not only your actual TDE encryption certificate in the master database, but also the master database's database master key, and in certain versions of SQL Server, the service master key for the entire instance of SQL Server must match. In later versions, they did fix that issue where you don't have to manually match the service master keys in most cases. However, depending on the version, you may have to go that far and actually physically sync those service master keys up so that the keys can be decrypted. I agree. That's the most likely scenario. Certificates.
What you'll likely have to do is exactly what Ed said. Verify everything matches across the board depending on your version of SQL Server. And then you'll have to do this again if you ever want to roll that cert, create a new cert and start using that instead. We did this quite a bit every 6 months at a previous company of mine, and it can be painful, but
quite necessary.
Yeah, and I'll reiterate that since I've done that multiple times. Definitely, make sure your cert's everywhere before you roll it, or rotate it, however you want to say it. But an auditor is definitely going to want you to change that probably at a minimum annually. And maybe even more frequently. So.
Okay, got another good one here. Got an availability group architecture. My listener is a multi-subnet listener with one subnet in Azure. AG fails if they fail over to the replica on the Azure subnet. What are the best mechanisms to help troubleshoot and resolve this?
None. The one thing that I keep, this is Edwin, by the way, the one thing that I keep telling DBAs is whether you like networking or not, yes, you have to learn how to love it, especially when you're moving to Azure. A lot of the intricacies that would impact your availability have nothing to do with SQL Server. So Azure Load Balancer and listener name as well becomes part of that. So understanding how does it work? How is it coordinating with your internal DNS and Azure-based DNSs and all of that. So really troubleshooting goes back to the basics and how Azure and networking works. So it's not fun, but it's part of the job. So you really have to understand how everything works.
Yeah, and I would follow onto that where I think a lot of DBAs, especially maybe that are newer to supporting AGs, the cluster log is going to educate you a lot on what happens. Echoing the not fun point, it is not fun to read, but just generating that and reviewing it. I go into a lot of places and, you know, they're having some sort of issue and I'll say, well, what do the error logs say? The SQL Server error log is not often very descriptive on such things. And so then I'll ask, what does the cluster log say? And a lot of times that hasn't been generated or viewed as part of the troubleshooting. So I would definitely recommend that. It will at least get you closer to kind of the bottom line of what happened.
And just as a side note for any DBAs that are out there that may not be familiar with what was just mentioned, the cluster log is not one of the standard error logs that you would find in Event Viewer in Windows. It is actually a separate log maintained in the background and not generated anywhere, not made in any sort of a readable format unless you issue a specific command to do so.
Right.
That used to be just a standard DOS command, and a couple of versions of Windows ago, they actually changed that over to PowerShell. So the command to generate that cluster log depends on which version of SQL or of Windows you're talking about. But you do have to go out and generate that. You may have to, in certain scenarios, change the level of verbosity of the cluster log in order to get the information you're looking for. But I have never seen a situation yet, even with some very complicated network issues, where you have not been able to get the information you need out of the cluster log if it has been generated.
Right, and there's also there's a good blog from John Morehouse, so that would be SQLRus.com, so SQLRus.com, where he gives some good tips about making the cluster log more human readable and getting some of the noise out. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. I believe he also has at the top of that article a selection of the commands you would need to generate it across different versions. But John's blog has certainly helped me in the past, and I think it would help other folks too.
So one common gotcha if we're talking about a multi-subnet situation. I've had issues periodically where, in addition to each subnet having to have a separate IP address for the listener, it's also important for the Windows cluster service to have an IP assigned for each subnet. Just off the top of my head, that's one of the big gotchas I've seen.
Yeah, any of those things could be a part of this, but that cluster log really will give you a lot of the details to really help you pinpoint what's missing there. Okay, next question. My database has been encrypted with a symmetric key. I'm able to add the database into the availability group, but when they fail over, you've got to open the master key. How do you make that work with automatic failover?
This is a scenario that I mentioned earlier. This is exactly how it plays out if you have not synchronized the service master keys. Because what's going on is that under a normal circumstance, the all of those symmetric keys, asymmetric keys, and such will be able to be automatically decrypted by SQL Server if the hierarchy is intact. But chances are very good that in this case, because they're failing over to a server with a different service master key, that hierarchy is broken because the master key in the database is not encrypted with the same service master key that it's expecting. Synchronize the service master keys by doing a backup on one server and a restore to the other, and you'll probably take care of the issue.
Sweet. Okay. This is a follow-up to the original question. What's the best way to monitor the latency between sites in an availability group? There's the built-in SSMS reports, but what other mechanisms do you all use? Crickets.
Yeah.
There are a few things inside the availability group, DMVs themselves, that will give you the latency on basically when things enter the log and when it's been committed remotely. There's ping traces. Ping is not a TCP connection with the SQL server, but you can use this to track the speed between the sites. There's a way, there's different tools out there that you can either purchase, and there's some open source ones that you can use to track the latency between sites and store it into some persistent data store. There's a lot of different things with the DMVs. The built-in reports are pretty good. The synchronous side of things, though, it doesn't really give you a great way to go see that. So it's more, what network level monitoring tools do you have between the sites?
Yeah, I was just sitting here trying to think about it, and for a lot of things I go to that I can't find within SQL Server, I go to perfmon, but perfmon doesn't track that either. I think you're probably going to be restricted to third-party tools of some sort, whether that's network monitoring or whether it's some of the things that you mentioned, David.
The one thing that I would highly recommend is to be in good terms with your network guys, because they have a full picture of it. And the one thing that
is critical.
The one thing that I'm starting to see with DBAs is, yeah, I want to figure this out without realizing, look, the other team has already done that. All you have to do is walk into their cubicle, ask what they're doing. Plus, keep in mind, they're probably doing packet shaping. So what you're seeing on the SQL Server side might not necessarily be what's happening on the whole network stack. So again, nothing wrong with going to the cubicle of the network guy who's responsible for this and just ask questions.
Yeah, and there's a broader point here. When I speak about these, I always try to sneak this in before we get into the techie stuff, is that when you're supporting availability groups, it's a complicated infrastructure. And unless you're in a very small shop, odds are you're going to have to be on good terms with network folks, with whoever's setting up the cluster, potentially storage folks as well. So spending some time, whether it's through management or personal relationships or whatever, but kind of breaking those barriers down, that's going to pay off, because when things go sideways, inevitably as DBAs, we own it because, quote, the database is down, and nobody's going to care that it's a network thing or a cluster thing or whatever. It's going to be on us. So the better we do to kind of pull those teams together, the easier our lives are going to be and the less we're going to get yelled at.
Yes, and I have a bit of grease that will help kind of lubricate the joints between the teams. It's called Death Wish Coffee here. People across your organization respond well to kindness, gifts of food, just being nice and wanting to work together. You'd be surprised at how open they are. And actually,
I buy folks a beer.
Yeah. It brings up a. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it's interesting. Most people, when they hear me speak at the FAST Summit, I tell them, look, I only talk about professional development topics. Like in the past Summit, I talked about managing your boss, and I talk about really specific use cases about availability groups. Specifically, why do you need to be able to be nice? And as David says, be nice. See, we don't teach people how to be nice, but when your database is down, that's the best weapon you could ever have to make sure that your database goes back online as quickly as it possibly can. Niceness is a tool.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys offering that information. I found that oftentimes being a database administrator comes with its own stigma. And so even if you are nice, if you haven't started that relationship, it can be, you have to spend extra time building it. Even if you're genuinely trying to be nice day to day, there's already that perception that you're not nice.
Yeah, and you know, as
Absolutely.
a consultant, these are the kind of things that, since I do deal with infrastructure and database technologies, these are the kind of challenges I have to work through. Now, an example of this, of being cross-silo oriented, it's a follow-up to this. Somebody mentioned perfmon counters for tracking network latency. There's one that I look at here, and if you're in perfmon, it's network interface, output queue length. I can't directly measure network latency, but I can tell if this server is having trouble sending its data to the destination. It might mean the network interface is maxed out. I doubt it. It might mean your WAN is either bottlenecked or something sluggish there. So just keep an eye on that.
David, this is Taiob. This is something I used very successfully for transaction replication latency measurement. This is a follow-up to a blog post that Kendra Little wrote many years ago. And so in my environment, what we have is we have a sample database for each availability group. Sorry, I take that back. We have a test availability group in every server where we use always an availability group. And we do not run this 24/7, but if we have a problem, we can turn this on. It does insert a statement with the date time stamp, and the frequency will depend on what you want to based on your environment, and you see how far behind you are in the target, means in your secondary replicas. And we do have a SSRS dashboard report that you can go and see how far behind your each availability group. As I said again, we don't run this 24/7. I used to run this in my environment where we used to use transactional replication heavily, continuously, so we could go in the dashboard, people can see the latency, but you can use that same code or the same process if you want to measure it. But again, if you're looking for millisecond, this is probably not the right solution. But if your latency is by seconds, this is something you can keep ready and deploy it when you need to do some diagnosis.
Nice. Nice. Okay, got a next question here. How do I get report subscriptions for SSRS, the jobs that it creates in SQL Agent? How do you get them to run on the secondary synchronous node, but to get all the other jobs to run on the primary? And that is a substantial challenge. Anybody have any tricks with this? I've got one. It's through PowerShell, but I want to let other people answer this one first.
So if I'm understanding his question right, he's wanting subscriptions to run on the read-only secondary, but all the rest of the reports to read on the primary.
Right.
Is that what
So
he's
essentially,
saying?
how can you automate essentially forcing the SSRS jobs to only fire on the secondaries, and that includes, an automated mechanism to handle an AG failover?
By default, as far as I know, there's no mechanism built in to do that. I think there's two methods that you would have to be able to approximate something like that. One is to go in and manually edit each job. That's probably, especially if you've got a lot of reports, that's probably not feasible. That's kind of the stock answer to everything.
No. What I've done to fix this, actually, I'll interrupt there. What I do is I have an external PowerShell script that I run on the alert that you can trigger on an availability group role change. What I do is I will query the database and I'll find the primary, and you can actually query the SSRS database directly, get the list of reports, and you could explicitly disable them with one update statement. And then you could find all the secondaries and go in and update them where appropriate. So John, I'm gonna message you directly here with my email address. And this goes for anybody else, just put something in the chat window. I will send you the script that I use for this, and you can modify it as needed. What I normally do, I don't do them on secondaries, I do them on the primaries, but to make sure that things don't automatically fire on the secondaries after a failover, I'll go in and get rid of those. So you could tweak this as needed.
The other thing that I think you could probably do is to change the connection string that you're using in the reports. That wouldn't cause the reports to fire on reporting services on the secondary, but it would cause them to use the data that's on the secondary. And it depends on what your intent of having them run on that node is, whether it's just to use that data or whether it's to, or actually have the report run in a different location. But that might be a possibility also. Make sure you're using the listener name for the database server name, and then there's a flag that you can put into a connection string to have it only read the secondary.
Yeah, it's more for the SSRS subscriptions themselves. Those get recreated every time SSRS turns on, which I usually recreate those by restarting SSRS on AG failover. So it's not a trivial task, but
no, definitely not.
So yeah, so for the gentleman that asked the question, I sent you my email address through the chat window. If anybody else is interested, just put a message in the chat window here, and I'll send you what I've got, and you can use it as a base to work with. Okay, next question, and this is kind of an open-ended question. Gentleman is new to availability groups. What tips and tricks do you have for the configuration, monitoring, and maintenance for a data warehouse type environment, especially when there is a tremendous amount of data that will be updated each evening after hours?
Why?
Well,
it's kind of like the question that I usually ask. If you're putting something on an availability group, but you have to know how to ask the why questions, because somebody would probably just say, hey, we need this to be on an availability group, without really understanding what the business requirements behind what's driving that decision. So ask the question, why do we need to put this on an availability group? I had a customer a couple of years back where it was an executive decision to put their data warehouse on an AG, and because somebody's always doing select star from inner join, it's always doing a memory dump, even though the server has like 512 gigs of RAM, and that's causing them more issues putting the data warehouse on an AG. So again, ask the question, why is it on an AG? What's the business decision behind putting it on an AG?
I would second that point. I mean, at one of the companies I've worked at, we would have these things that were called storms, because it was kind of the data warehouse was kind of the Wild West. Researchers would go in and they just run these models that would run into each other left and right, and we really had no way of controlling that environment. And is that the right environment for an AG? Maybe not.
Sounds good. Yeah, all of those. Let's just state that the use of the AG is required here for day-to-day purposes. What tips do you have for managing the availability group replica queues, things like that, or with changing out a lot of data in after hours times?
Well, one thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to look at what's your tolerance level, because someone comes in and runs a big report, right? Your secondary may fall behind a bit. What's your tolerance on that, right? That should probably be an async as opposed to synchronous if they're going to do something like that. Also, what's your plan to get, this would be true of any data warehouse, what's your plan to get it back online? Are you going to use ETL processes to rebuild your data warehouse? How are you backing it up? What's your restore process? That's something you need to know as well. Those things get more complicated when you start talking about availability groups. If you have to do a restore, now it's not just one replica, it's several. So, I mean, there's a lot of questions, a lot of thought that has to go into these decisions. But for a data warehouse, I would expect that, people are going to be running bigger queries, so secondary may lag behind.
Hence my comment earlier about asking the why questions, because just because it's already there doesn't mean it's necessary to be there, and asking the non-technical questions will get you the right answer, and probably not the good way to put your data warehouses in an AG. Now, if there is indeed an RPO and RDO business requirement backing that up, then we start thinking about how to move it forward, maybe redesign, maybe re-architect. But again, ask the basic why questions. Why is it necessary to put a data warehouse in an AG?
Yeah. Bottom line, this is all great stuff. Okay, next question here. A lot of availability group topics today. How often should patches be added to an availability group? And what is the correct procedure? I mean, the question here was, is it correct to patch a secondary node first? And then a follow-up question that, do you use snapshots to roll out new releases to the AGs? And should they be done on the secondaries first?
So typically I do DR first, then passive secondaries, and I start working my way up. Then we'll do failovers for any active secondaries or primaries and start doing those as a final step. But again, it's like you start off with your production, or sorry, you start off with your dev, test, production, but within each of these, like usually around staging is when you'll find your first actual availability group, right? And there you follow the same process so that you can test the process of doing DR, secondaries, primaries. And
Yeah,
hopefully you find issues.
Yeah, in terms of frequency, my personal preference with Microsoft going to a bi-monthly cumulative update at this point, I roll them out to lower environments, but I honestly like to apply these not immediately after they're released, but fairly quickly. I don't like to let time lapse because they are introducing new features with the cumulative updates at this point.
Well, and the other thing along with this is that many of these do contain security patches, and SQL Server does get hacked. It does happen, and we want to make sure that we are staying current with security patches as much as possible. So yes, that definitely I definitely follow Brandon's recommendation to start with DR, then go to secondaries, then go to primaries, and work your way back up. That minimizes the disruption to the system, and just make sure you're doing it early and doing it often. Do your due diligence, make sure that you're not introducing some sort of a big flaw. Wait a few days to make sure nobody else runs into a massive flaw, but do it relatively quickly because they're releasing it for a reason.
Yeah, don't let it go too long.
Yeah, the one thing that I also highlight, especially in with my consulting practice and my training program, is treat installing patches as an upgrade project. What do I mean by that? Just because it worked in staging, it worked in dev, it's guaranteed to work in production, which means you have to have the proper rollback plan, you have to have the proper change management process and plan, because again, it's not going to be 100% guaranteed all the time. Just because it worked in UAT and staging, I cannot guarantee that it's going to work in production. So treat installing patches as an upgrade project.
You know what's interesting at my company is that all the CUs and stuff like that for SQL Server are automatically applied to my dev and QA and UAT environments. So long before that ever goes to prod, like he was just saying, it's already been tested. So luckily, in our environment, of course, the bad thing is if I have a bad one, it's going to affect everybody. The good thing is if it goes clear, then it basically I don't have to patch the lower environments myself.
As a corollary to this, make sure that your Windows administrators are also patching your Windows level on all of these servers the same way. Make sure that you say no, that you have that you're clustered. Make sure that they're thinking about that as they're doing this. Make sure that they are looking for which node is the primary, and doing that one last. I can't tell you the number of times I've run into that at the client sites where they have their database going up and down and up and down and up and down, and it frequently turns out to be something along the lines of them of a Windows patch that's being applied to the nodes in the availability group, or even a failover cluster in kind of a random order.
And it's annoying. It's so annoying.
Yep. I've even had some cases where they have applied it to all nodes simultaneously, and crash the entire SQL server. Because
Wow.
I've seen that.
Exactly.
And this is this goes back to my earlier comment about being nice, because if your Windows administrators don't know anything about how it is affecting the availability group, chances are they'll probably do no draining, because that's what the Microsoft documentation says. They'll probably do uncheck the preferred or the possible owners list, because that's what the Microsoft documentation says on the cluster itself, but not necessarily for AG. So talk to your Windows administrators and tell them, look, these are the impacts of what you guys are doing to our AGs. And so you have to let them know, because if they end up removing one of the replicas from the possible owners list, that's not going to change the metadata on the availability group replicas as an automatic failover. So these small details can impact the availability of your databases.
And as a follow-on to that, make sure that they're also, if they are wanting to move an availability group replica, that they're not trying to force that from Failover Cluster Manager. They may not know that that's something that's an operation that needs to happen from SQL Server's perspective and not from the cluster's perspective. And so this is another time when it makes a lot of sense to have that good relationship with them and make sure that there's a lot of two-way communication going back and forth, because that can wreak havoc with your SQL Server as well if the cluster changes owners out from underneath the SQL Server without the SQL Server being aware.
Yep.
Exactly. Okay.
Same is true, before we move on, same is true of understanding when folks are going to do upgrades of ESXi hosts, right?
Yep.
If any infrastructure underneath you, if it's going to be patched, you generally want to know about that, and that's why change management exists. It's a chance for you to be aware of what other teams are planning, and you absolutely should go to your change management board meetings.
Okay, next question here. Is there a tweak to shrink logs if you need to, not routinely, of databases that are either log shipped, replicated, or part of an availability group?
No.
So back up the log.
Short answer, no. With an availability group, you cannot shrink the log while it is part of the availability group. You have to remove it from the availability group in order to do that.
Just say, keep it from growing like that with more frequent log backups, if that's an option. These things happen. Somebody makes a big update, somebody loads in something massive that does tons of updates that you're not aware of. I mean, it happens, but there's not a great way to deal with it.
I've seen environments where they just take log backups, a minute, or I've seen ones where they take it constantly. They just have a loop literally running in the scheduler to backup log, over and over again. And that may be overkill, but if you really want to keep it as small as possible, that's probably one of your better options.
Now, if you do get to the situation for whatever reason, and I have seen it happen, if you do get to the situation where you do have to shrink the log for some reason, happens. But no matter how much we try, it is a fairly easy process to just remove that database from the availability group, shrink the log on the primary, bring everything back in. The reason that can't be done while the availability group is active on that database is because that is an operation which requires single user access to the database server while it is being started. So you do have to take it out. As soon as that operation is done, though, you can bring it back in, and there should not be any problem with bringing those databases back into the AG. I've never had a problem with it.
Unless it's a TDE, then it's a little bit more challenging.
Yes, agreed.
TDE, the TSA of the database world.
That's funny. Okay, next question. What is the best practice if we want to use linked servers with an AG listener in the same subnet and also multi-subnet architectures? The production server needs to connect over a linked server.
That shouldn't matter really, because the linked server is going to be in the system database. The definition of the linked server is going to be kept in master, I believe.
So essentially, as long as you've got that linked server created on all the AG replicas, you should be okay.
And if you don't,
so.
DBA Tools is a great way of moving it over there.
Yeah.
Yes.
Or even validating that it is there. Then you could automate a check for that and build it if it ever gets dropped.
It should.
Yeah, the combination of DBA Tools.
Go ahead.
Yeah.
I was going to say the combination of DBA Tools and Rob Sewell's DBA checks with the pester testing would be a great way to check for the link servers and make sure they're there on a test that fails.
Yeah, and one of the things that DBA Tools does with like SQL logins is that it will preserve the security ID, the SID, and that's what usually trips up people when they create the same login, same password. If the security ID is different, then the logins don't map to the databases the same way, and you have to fix them. But if you do that ahead of time, so if you had a link server, if you had a particular login that you wanted to use, just make sure that that's registered on all of the servers that you need to have this link server connected with.
Yep. Okay. Next question. Are there any special HA or DR considerations for using an availability group with databases that are using both replication and change data capture? It's kind of a perfect storm there.
Back up your logs frequently.
Yeah.
The jobs
try to find another way.
The jobs on the secondary needs to be created once you fail over for change data capture. You cannot have those jobs running in both sides.
So I would say a little bit of PowerShell and or scripting there in conjunction with the availability group role change alerts that you can fire on both nodes. I think that would be one of your best friends there.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, if there's any interest, at some point I don't mind doing a session where the whole session is we just literally pick one of these tasks and we automate it in PowerShell live.
Send me an abstract. That's awesome.
Okay, I will.
Cool. You just volunteered yourself. Good job. Cool. Okay. Next question here, and this is a good, more of a business case question. How do companies that use basically, how do they use read-only routing and or production availability groups to push the databases and availability groups to lower environments? You know, what automation do you have to basically state, I want to take these databases and this AG from prod and hit a button and have them automatically refresh into an AG in a lower environment? Honestly,
so
my thoughts on that would just be a little bit of custom scripting with DBA tools, but I'll let you guys chime in.
So there's a few different ways to do that, and some of it depends on your underlying infrastructure. DBA tools is a great way to, take a backup of a database and copy it into a dev environment. There's also some people have done this with clones, either through their SANs. Purees, for example, have PowerShell commandlets that are database aware as long as your database is configured in a specific way. Otherwise, it's still doable, but a little harder. I've seen other companies that have actually done it at the vSphere layer. Cloning at a very, very low level there, but it requires a lot of knowledge. So if you can do it higher up, if you can get away with letting DBA tools do it for you, that's going to be one line of PowerShell.
Well, my question would be is if you're pushing that data from a prod environment to a lower environment, what kind of security and data privacy anomalies are in that database, and what are you doing to protect that data? I would be more concerned about that than trying to get the data down to the lower environment. All the regulatory things that you need to pay attention to.
I was just going to make a comment to that same effect. this is something that in the U.S. we haven't traditionally had this concern, but it's going to be coming up more and more as new legislation takes effect. Pay attention to this. This is definitely a question to ask yourself anytime that you're considering any new changes like this. Is there a different way to accomplish this than to wholesale take that database from production down to the lower environment? You may not have that concern now, but you probably will within the next few years.
I know in our situation, we actually weekly back up our FCI availability group down to an obfuscation server, and then we obfuscate the data, and then we move it on down further down the line. But we're definitely not doing it with an AG hooked up to it. Are you wanting to do it because of real time to get the real time data from production? But again, that data privacy and security thing, there's going to be a lot of people that would frown upon it, and governments.
And I think moving forward is just having that mindset that whatever data that you're managing is sensitive, critical. And so you have to always keep that thing in mind, whether you're taking backups, restoring, or anything that you do for that matter, is always having that mindset that this is sensitive data. How do we deal with it? Because the automation part is easy, but without that mindset of this is critical data, this is something that we need to protect, then, it's just like, open data that's available for anybody. So always keep that in mind.
Don't become one of the data breaches, out there.
No.
Yeah.
Yes, do avoid that at all possible.
Yeah.
And don't forget, you don't want to accidentally email a customer because you're working on something in dev, even beyond, in addition to the data security issues. You don't want to accidentally send somebody a message that is, under development, not ready for prime time.
Yeah.
There was actually
there's a question, and I'd almost like to raise a hand of all the panelists. How many of us has actually done that?
I haven't done it, but my environment, it happens often enough.
Yeah. I haven't done it either, but I mean, it easily could have happened.
Yeah, and I struggle to get people to understand that implication, and basically it comes down to, look, I'm going to find your banking information, your credit card number, and I'm going to put it in the database. So if it is breached, you're going to get the first spam. And there's another high availability technique that's been in the press a lot, is people getting a lot of huge data sources and putting them on unsecured storage in the cloud, and people find it. And they're talking hundreds of millions of records. And that's something where the business, or some people in the business, are very keen to, I need all of your data. And, the best you can do is make sure that if they have access to a non-production source, that it doesn't have, you've scrubbed the protected information as best you can. Because it's going to leave your responsibility at that point. And, well, it's going to leave your hands. It's still your responsibility to make sure it's secure.
Yep. Okay, next question here is, I'd like a script in PowerShell that fires on an alert from a role change. Well, I'm going to send you to a blog post right here over at SQL Server Central. Essentially, what you can do is you can fire PowerShell or anything else, any other scripts, based on an availability group role change. So I'm going to zoom in. If you can see this, there's a number of things you would need to fire on. So there's the availability group role change on message ID 1480. There's a data movement suspended, message ID 35264, and data movement resumed is 35265. If you fire off of those and then fire whatever PowerShell you need, it could actually work. And you can have PowerShell that will connect into your availability group listener, so it always connects to the active member and then grabs whatever you need there. Okay, so next question here. Let's see, what are your thoughts on having one AG on the primary and a secondary AG on the secondary node for things such as SSRS, reporting, things like that? I think it goes back to Edwin's comment earlier. It's what would be the advantage of doing that? And there are definite advantages to it, but what would be the advantage of, or why specifically would you want to do that?
So where I'm at, we don't have data warehouses built, and there are a lot of day-to-day reports that are pulled by our executive team. So they're basically written off of our transactional databases, which they understand is not ideal. However, that work hasn't been prioritized. So one of the things that we did do is set up a secondary availability group with read-only routing where they can send those report requests to the secondary server while our main primary read-write server can be used for our general application purposes.
Cool. Okay. Next question here. We have a third-party application that uses an old legacy OLADB connection that does not support multi-subnet failover. Is there a way to automate that connection failing over to DR in the event that something fails over because it is on a different subnet?
There's always a way, but it's not necessarily easy because DNS is involved at this point.
And I would argue that that's something to take up with the vendor as well. If they're supporting a very old connection library, maybe they should update that.
Yeah, but that's easier said than done.
I've run into vendors that flatly refuse to do that. But the short version is that if you don't have multi-subnet failover, is true, you're going to have a much longer failover time, and you're going to have to your DNS update is going to be involved. And so is it possible? Sure, pretty much anything is possible with enough scripting. Is it going to be easy? No. And is it going to be reliable? Are you going to get the benefits of the AG? Probably not. It might not be a good choice of technology in a situation like that. You might be better off going with something like a failover cluster, which probably is supported by that vendor.
Yep. Okay, next question here, and I'm going to take this one first. What are your thoughts of using VMs as the nodes in a Windows Server failover cluster? And quite frankly, do it. And at this point, the need to have a machine stay physical to me is extremely small. And it's rare for me to actually recommend that. The only caveat I would say is make sure your VM admins have what's called anti-affinity rules set up so that the multiple members of that Windows Server failover cluster cannot reside on the same physical machine. Because if that physical machine fails and all your replicas go down, your HA solution is up in smoke. So as long as you can get that in there, I see nothing wrong at all with keeping all of these things as VMs. Anybody have anything to add to that one?
David, in our environment, we actually have a failover cluster instance with a third node AG, and they're all VMs, every single one of them. So it's very possible.
Yep, and I have one client, they're a big financial company, and these massively huge Cisco servers, and what they did was they virtualized their available replicas, and only one is running on those UCS. And the thing is, they wanted to leverage virtualization for other things like ease of migration, stuff like that. So yes, even if it's a high throughput, high volume, you could put it on VM.
Something I've run into in the past is that you get the argument from some non-SQL people that, well, the SQL server is going to take up all of the resources of this host. What's the difference between just putting it on a host by itself in the VM environment and just making it a physical box and just being done with it? We're just adding that overhead.
Improved AK. If that physical machine goes down and that OS is not abstracted away from the hardware, that machine is down until that physical machine gets repaired. If it's in a VM, that VM gets restarted on another known good node, it's back up and running, you're up and running in a couple minutes, and your HA solution becomes intact much, much, much quicker. Okay. Let's see, I got a couple more questions in here. I know we're a couple minutes over, but I'm good if you all are. Does read-only routing allow reports to run stored procs to get data? Answer is definitely yes, as long as whatever is calling it is able to do the read-only routing command in the connection string. Otherwise, yeah, it's just business as usual. Anybody have any other questions? Any comments?
Well, I was just going to say that for those folks that don't know, that's usually flagged as application intent. So I think like on SQL command, it's like -K, but for anything else, it's a property you set on the connection. So you set the application intent to read only, and that's basically that connection raising its hand to the availability group listener and saying, all I want to do is read, please send me somewhere to do that. And then off it goes.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Got one last question here, and this is a really good one. It's a gentleman who says the majority of the customers that he works with use SQL Server Standard Edition. So heard from Jonathan Caius at the past summit that transactional replication is a good method to get read-only replicas while using standard. Is it something that we would use for cost savings, not moving to enterprise? Now, I've got my personal opinion on this, but I'm going to let you all open this one up.
I personally would stay away from replication. It's just when it gets its, self in a knot, it's really fun to try to get it out. That's just personally.
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan either of replication. It's a real pain when it goes south. But that's me.
I'll say that goes back to my comments and my thoughts. For me personally, I think it's an okay and honestly a pretty good solution if you're forced to run standard edition and if you need read-only replicas, and if you're 100% comfortable with managing transactional replication and you're willing to accommodate the trade-offs that come with it when it hiccups.
That's a lot of ands.
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that, what's your time worth? Because you've got this very complex scenario now where you've got the transactional replication layered on top of the availability group with all of the maintenance. So all of the maintenance is required by both solutions. The coordination is required by both solutions. The potential brittleness, not necessarily guaranteed, but potential brittleness of the replication solution. And the need to actually monitor that replication solution to make sure it doesn't break. All of these things add up, and there's probably a dozen other things I'm not thinking of off the top of my head. But what's your time worth to manage all of this? And compare that against the cost of the cost and the benefits of upgrading to Enterprise Edition. You may be surprised. You need to do that ROI analysis because, frankly, if you actually do need that read-only replication or read-only routing solution, if that's what you really need, chances are you've probably got a bigger environment that would probably benefit a lot from some of the benefits of Enterprise Edition in the first place. It'd be worth just evaluating that to see if you can make the case.
I think the question. Sorry.
That's okay. I think to piggyback on that is, again, DBAs and technical professionals don't even look at the business aspect of this, and we're just thinking, oh, it's enterprise, it's more expensive. It's about time that we start looking at the business side of what we're doing. Is standard edition, and again, to piggyback on that, is standard edition really going to be cheap? That's upfront cost versus ongoing maintenance and operational cost. And because we're not conditioned to think of the finance aspect of what we're doing, we'll just say, hey, let's just use standard edition. I'll come up with my own tools versus what's the ROI if you're doing that moving forward.
I think I would almost turn it around. I think the question I would ask in that environment is, if you're running on standard edition and you really actually honestly do not have any other requirements that drive you towards enterprise edition, do you really need a completely up-to-date copy, or is your business model simple enough that you might actually kind of be okay with like a daily refresh of a database backup as opposed to wrestling with transactional replication?
That's a good point.
All the complexity that Ed talked about and others have mentioned, in replication itself, let's not forget that we have now introduced application complexity because we need, toggles and switches and flow control to direct the application to the read-only environment for those read-only reports, as opposed to writing to the OLTP environment. So the database layer is more complex, and the application layer is more complex.
That's a very good point.
Yeah, it's not an easy answer to a really good question. There's so many caveats. I mean, standard DBA answer, it depends, right?
Yeah. I think it comes down to taking a look at the complete cost and the complete benefits of the solution, and really work with your finance people. Sit down, figure it out exactly what it would cost, and don't think about these numbers in terms of your household budget, because if you're looking at it from what your personal perspective, it's terrifyingly expensive to even consider Enterprise Edition. If you look at it in the grand scheme of many businesses' budgets, it could be pocket change, and it may be very, very easy to justify the additional cost of something like Enterprise Edition. You just have to be able to put it in terms that they can put down on their balance sheets. Don't necessarily dismiss it without talking to them if you actually do need a technology like that in place.
And if you're looking at it for Enterprise Edition in that perspective as only for read-only routing, not for true run the business workload, you might be able to get away with a lower core count, which will save you some money on Enterprise Edition as well. So don't forget to think about that too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll say from our perspective, we're a very small company, about 300 people. And I literally have one production server. It's doing a lot of stuff, but we're running enterprise. We're a small company and we run enterprise with SA. So, the benefits of the different things it allows you to do, especially if you are not running 2019, you might need to turn on TDE, which is enterprise only until you get to 2019, especially with these data privacy laws coming.
Right.
So when you talk to management, management's going to care about two things. They're going to care about how does Enterprise Edition help you reduce risk to the organization, and what is the cost benefit of that risk reduction. So if you put your argument in such a way as saying, look, we spent X amount of dollars last year because we had to deal with these issues that wouldn't be an issue if we'd had these features from Enterprise Edition, that'll make the case for you.
Exactly.
Now he's got to follow up to that exact point. If you've not maintained transactional replication before, how can you estimate how much time managing that solution would actually add to the DBA responsibilities? How can you actually get that cost when you've never managed this stuff before? And that is a fantastic question.
It is a fantastic question.
Take whatever estimate you get and multiply it by about 3 or 4.
Yeah. So you've got a learning curve here that you have to take into account. First and foremost, any new technology like this, yeah, you can go read about it, but until you've been working with it for about 3 to 6 months, you're going to be finding a lot of gotchas here and there, maybe even longer than that, right? Do you have anyone on your team that has worked with transactional replication in the past, right? What is the current state of the team? And how big of a ramp up do you have to get to where you need to be able to manage this thing comfortably? And what is the impact of potential issues in the meantime? Those are the things you need to kind of look at when you're trying to estimate the impact of this. So it's not an easy question to answer. Do what Rob said. Take whatever your best guess is and quadruple it.
Well, the other part that I would even say on that would be is if you turn around and your replication goes sideways and you have to hire a consultant DBA to come in to help you, and it takes him, 3 weeks or whatever, you're going to, and a good consultant, you're going to pay dearly for him, and it's going to cost you.
But a good consultant is going to be worth their weight, because they're going to help review your planned architecture, or even help you design that architecture in the first place. And then they're going to also provide you training and hopefully documentation to help you maintain this thing, right? You get the benefit of their experience in this regard.
No, and I agree with you. I was thinking more of after the fact, that you've put it in and all of a sudden it went sideways on you, and now you got to hire someone to help you get it fixed.
I would say hire the consultants to help you get it in the first place, but that's me.
Yes.
Yeah, and make like the training and the documentation part of their statement of work, is that they're not just there to fix the problem, they're there to help you fix the problem later without their help. They don't leave until you demonstrate that you understand it and you can work with it.
Problems notwithstanding, I would say that one key piece to include in this is that even if you have a transaction replication solution that works perfectly, you're going to want to spend probably 15 to 30 minutes per day to monitor this and make sure and review that everything is working as planned and as expected, making sure that things are keeping up, that your latency is not getting behind, that the data is getting into the right places at the right times. Because there's not like there is a replication monitoring solution, but it was not designed with quick reviews necessarily in mind. It requires a certain amount of time each and every day in order to make sure that it continues to run the way it's expected and that it's continuing to run correctly. So it's one of those things that you do have to make sure that you're reserving enough time for every month, and that's where the costs really add up.
And I would add too, I do know a former coworker of mine. They're at a utility billing company. They're using standard edition in AWS. They're using a third-party disk replication tool to handle some of their availability and failover. I've used that tool myself. It's relatively economical. It's definitely cheaper as a standard, plus the cost of that tool is much cheaper than enterprise, and they've had no problems with it. And he's been doing SQL Server DR for 20 years, and he doesn't really want to use replication anymore. And there are other options available besides replication. The one question with replication, because one of its advantages is that you don't have to replicate the entire database. And if that's an option there, if you start looking at what do you really need to replicate and what do you really need to be available immediately, you can start looking at other options like CDC, change data capture, change tracking even, and start replicating just part of your database. And that might bring some of the burden down. And that way either make replication easier to manage or open up a third-party application or alternative.
This has been awesome. I think we have covered all of the questions. If any of you have any other questions, feel free to contact us through the PASS website, because honestly, some of these questions we could make full hour-long presentations on. So what I'd love to do is to hear from you. If there's any topics you'd like to hear, anything that we didn't cover to your satisfaction, let us know, because honestly, I am looking for all sorts of folks with tons of ideas for topics that we can all create sessions on for you. So thank you all for attending. Thank all the speakers here for taking time out of their crazy schedules to be a part of this. I'll get the recordings up on the PASS YouTube channel, and thank you all. So